And, share the text. Okay, so we'll pick up with chapter 2, Mishnah 9, and we are in a series of statements attributed to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Brief recap on who he is. First of all, the term Rabban, as opposed to Rav or Rebbe, both of which we would translate into English as rabbi. Rabban is the title. Actually, it's Aramaic, meaning our rabbi, our teacher, which is the title given to the head of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin being the court of 70 elders, which determined the halacha. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was responsible for moving the Sanhedrin from Jerusalem shortly before it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE to Yavna, which is a town on the coast near what is today Tel Aviv. By the way, it probably doesn't apply to anybody but me, but there is this very funny Israeli TV show called Kupa Rashid, which is known as Checkout in English. We were given a gift subscription to a streaming service called HiFlix, which shows a lot of Jewish and Israeli stuff. And this is a quite funny comedy that it's like The Office or it's one of those like fake cinema verite documentaries, only it takes place in a supermarket, and the supermarket is in Yavne. Yavne is still, and I spent the Shabbat in Yavne once. It's a suburb now of Tel Aviv. Anyway, Rabban Yochanan made sort of a compromise with the Romans that allowed him to get out of Jerusalem with a bunch of scholars and reestablish the Sanhedrin in Yavne, where it remained for a couple of 100 years at least. Okay, so Amar Lahem, he said, and I'm going to slide down and we'll just look at the English translation. Rabbi Yochanan said unto his disciples, go forth and observe which is the right way to which a man should plead. Right. In other words, what is the path that is a good path that you should follow? Rabbi Eliezer said, a good eye. Rabbi Joshua said, a good companion, or Haver Tov, a good friend. Rabbi Yossi said, a good neighbor. Rabbi Shimon said, foresight. And Rabbi Elazar said, a good heart. Okay, and Rabban Yochanan said to them, I prefer the words of Elazar ben Arach, for in his words, your words are included. Okay, any comments or questions or thoughts on the couple sentences we just read?
Yeah, he says a good eye, and then later we'll find, I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but we're going to find about an evil eye. What are we talking about there?
A good eye, I mean, that's a good question. I actually looked at the Bar Tanura, the sort of the standard commentary on the Mishnah, and because the way at least Bartanura understands what this means, which is not the way that I would normally understand if I said a good eye, meaning the ability to see the good in every person or every situation. Okay, that's what Bartanura says that Yochanan ben Zakkai means by a good eye. And the evil eye, then, I mean, you're not revealing anything that, would be presumably exactly the opposite, right? I mean, like, the phrase, pardon my language, right? Somebody who sees the world through shit-colored glasses.
Rabbi, does it translate as good eye? Good eye?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's look at the Hebrew.
What's good? What's evil?
Right.
Said in 70 CE.
Some things are absolutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, eye in
Started
Tova,
around-
a good eye. Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
my perception was yours of being able to see the good in things, people, the world. But thinking about it, could it also be a keen eye for taking in everything, for absorbing important things? Like I have a good eye for good art. I mean, that's a stupid example, but
Right. I mean,
authenticity.
yeah. I think in this context, it probably doesn't mean that.
Okay.
Right? Because we're talking really about like character traits or whatever. I mean, look, a good eye is certainly important, right? I mean, you say like, he's a good judge of horse flesh, for example, right? Or has a keen eye for beauty, right? Which would be certainly something desirable.
Right.
But that's not like,
No, I see it the same way you do as the antithesis to evil eye. But to go
right.
back to something you asked before and we didn't respond, when all of them were quoted with the things that were important, my answer to that would be when you said, was it Rabbi Yochanan you were talking about? I would see all of them as the embodiment of a fine, wonderful, wholesome, relevant human being.
Sure. I mean, they're not
Exclusive.
exclusive, right? And he's not, I mean, and especially by saying that he prefers the words of Elazar ben Arach because they include all of them, right? So, it seems to me that is a counsel against sort of fanaticism, right? That is to say, what is fanaticism in this context? To emphasize one particular character trait over all the others, right? I mean, it's like very popular for some people in our society to be quite rude on the excuse, well, I'm only speaking truthfully, right? And it's important to speak truthfully, but that's not the only value, right? Yes, it's important to speak truthfully, but it's also important to be tactful and to be kind and to be compassionate, right? And sometimes, I mean, it depends on the context, right? But, to be truthful in a way that is wildly offensive and actually has no real purpose, that's a type of fanaticism that I think Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai would counsel against. And I think, I mean, in fact, his biography would indicate that. I mean, I think Rabban Yochanan is opposed to fanaticism of all sorts, right? Because Rabban Yochanan said, you know, the Romans are going to destroy Jerusalem, and we could either keep fighting and, you know, keep fighting to the last man, or we could seek some sort of compromise, right? And if, you know, absent Rabban Yochanan's decision to compromise with the Romans and get out of that the ability to preserve Jewish scholarship, albeit not in Jerusalem, we would not be having this discussion. We would absolutely not be having this discussion, because Judaism would have died out, right? And the oral Torah certainly would have died out, right? So it's, you know, it's not easy to figure some of this stuff out, right? And particularly when you have responsibility. I mean, you know, I mean, because to me, I mean, the beauty of this text, of this type of text, is that it's eternally relevant, right? And so, you know, I was having a discussion this morning with Kelly about Mayor Bowser's decision to paint over the Black Lives Matter mural. And look, there is a part of me that would like nothing better than for her to tell him, you know, to take a long walk off a short pier, right? But the reality is he controls 70% of the budget of the city, right? And she's responsible for that. And it's a galling price to pay, but it's a relatively small price to pay to maintain the independence of the District of Columbia, right? And it's easy for, frankly, for my wife on a couch in Montgomery Village to say that that's something that shouldn't be done. But she's not responsible for meeting the DC government's payroll. She's not responsible for providing police and fire and ambulance and schools to 750,000 people in the District of Columbia, right? And so that, and it's galling. It is absolutely galling, in the same way that I have no doubt that the zealots in Jerusalem in 70 CE were hanging Yochanan ben Zakkai in effigy, right? But absent Yochanan ben Zakkai, we would not be here as Jews. So, you know, so I think that that is a counsel against fanaticism in all manners of being. All right.
So he alludes to the words of Elazar ben Arak, but he doesn't tell us what they are. Have we?
No, Rabbi, a good heart. Rabbi Elazar is Rabbi Elazar ben Arak.
Right, but where are the words? I'm not. Oh, I'm sorry, that one. Okay.
Yeah.
That Elazar.
A good heart. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Okay. No, that's okay. I mean, it does, it throws you off because it just says Elazar and then he says Elazar ben Arak.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Right. I mean, why is a good heart? I mean, and I looked at what Bartanura said, because it's not like intuitive to me that a good heart actually does include all of the other characteristics under it. But Bartanura says that, for the rabbis, the heart, I mean, we tend to look, we understand that there's a difference between the biological heart and the metaphorical heart, right? But for us, the metaphorical heart is what? What is the what is the metaphorical heart? What does it do? Yeah, Dee, just hop in. Just jump in.
It softens us. It speaking only metaphorically, as you said, it makes us be compassionate. It helps us to maybe have some humility, to reach out to. I've got so many things in my head, I can't get the words out to put it all together. But I think it works as a companion to the brain, and I guess the best way I can put it is in an analogy, because I've seen so many of them recently. You can be the most highly skilled and successful medical person, doctor, surgeon, whatever. But if you don't have any empathy or sensitivity or compassion for what the patient is going through, besides the fact that you might lose business, it's not going to work to the advantage of the patient. So I think that the heart is a companion, maybe even a what's the word I want? Like a check and balance on the brain.
Okay. I mean, it's the seat of the emotions, really.
Right.
Right. But Bartanura says I mean, the heart in the rabbinic Mishnaic schema is more analogous to the mind, okay, than simply the seat of the emotions. Okay, so which is interesting, Dee, because what you're saying is that in this schema, the brain and the heart keep each other in check, right? But for Rabban Yochanan, if Bartanur is right, and I'm just gonna stipulate that he is, okay? The brain and the heart don't keep each other in check. They actually
Collide.
Things that we would attribute to the brain, he attributes actually to the heart. Okay, so I would translate the word lev. I mean, even though literally it means heart, I think a better translation in this context would actually be mind. Right? And if you read this as a good mind as opposed to a good heart, then the statement that everything else is included in that actually starts to make sense. So I'm going to think that Bartanura is actually right. And the reason that I'm hesitant about saying that is that, Bartanura is 1,500 years after this. So, it's not like they're inhabiting the same thought universe. Okay.
Rabbi, just jumping on what you just said, strikes something interesting for me. if what you're saying, if I understand what you're saying is true, then in fact, having a good mind actually makes a good heart. I can't get it out, but it's a different way of looking at than what I said.
Right. But of course, but mind again, I mean, once you use words metaphorically, different people understand them differently, right? Mind doesn't mean like, we could say about somebody, oh, he has a brilliant mind, but he's a jerk, right?
Right.
That's not what mind means in this context, right? Mind really means more the way the Buddhists would read it, right? That it's not merely the intellect, it's your whole sort of
Being your whole
way
being.
of being. Yeah. Yeah.
But it also encompasses decency and compassion and the positive qualities
Right.
that a person should have.
Right. Exactly. So it's, I mean, if you think about it, right? One of the basic prayers of Judaism that we say twice a day, right? Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the Lord your God, bechol levavcha, right? With all your heart, right? And again, I mean, very, very difficult because, and I don't want to, who am I kidding? I don't want to stray too far afield. It's all I do, right? But, um, how can the Torah command us to have a certain emotion, right? And the answer is the Torah does not command us to have a certain emotion because love, God, here is not an emotion, it's an action. It means to be loyal to, right? And so with all your heart means really with all your
Faculties.
way of being, right? So it's this, but it's the same word, lev or levav. Okay.
When you talk about straying, here's a curve. If God supposedly gave us free will, doesn't that kind of play havoc with what we're talking about? I mean, if we have free will and we're mean people, nothing's working right.
No, quite the opposite. We can be mean people because we have free will. See, free will is not license, okay? Free will means we have the ability to do wrong.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that God gives us the ability to do all kinds of things against the Torah because we're not robots.
Right.
It doesn't mean that when we do things against the Torah, it's okay because we have free will.
No,
right?
I'm
That's
not.
like being pulled over on 270 because you're going 100 miles an hour. And when you wind up in court, Alan argues, well, look, the car's capable of going 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, but
right?
you changed what I was saying. Now I lost how to refute what you just said. All I'm saying is God gave us free will. And
Right.
at the time we're looking at the attributes that essentially we should be embodying. We having free will, yes, it doesn't mean we should use free will in a bad way. It just means that we're able to do so. And for those of us who do use free will that way, we have minimized, if not in fact eliminated, some of the attributes that right now that we're talking about.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Thank God. Finally
Exactly.
made sense
I
of
mean,
thought.
no, I mean, look, I mean, all right. You've hit upon, I think, a really important question, okay? That in our psychoanalytical age, right? I mean, do we have free will at all? Right? Do we have free will at all? Right? I mean, is every bad thing that we do because our parents screwed us up? Right? Or because, our second grade teacher was mean to us and made us sit in the corner and allowed little Johnny to make fun of us. Right? And so because, my parents neglected me and my second grade teacher was mean, and so that's why I do the horrible things I do, and therefore I'm not responsible.
Yeah,
Right?
but you're talking about things that were causative, but you still have the ability to not use those things. You still have the ability to embody all those traits. It's just a harder journey, but you still have the ability by free will and by commandment or Torah teaching or rabbinical interpretation, whatever, to embody those traits in spite of what's been done to you. It's just harder.
Right. But not everybody would.
Right.
Not everybody would. Right? There are some people who say, no, it's, I mean, particularly people who are seeking to evade responsibility for their own actions. Right? And sometimes they make that argument successfully, right? But Rabbi Yochanan would say, you have the ability to develop these positive personality traits. You are not a prisoner of your environment or of your heredity, for that matter, right? I mean, but it's a complicated. I mean, if you remember, I mean, and sadly, it was like before the idea of recording stuff was widespread, but Mark Comrade and I did a whole program on the question, do we have free will? Right? To a certain extent, right, our criminal justice system is predicated on the assumption that we do have free will. But, all right, anybody, Alan, I see you muting and unmuting, like.
Yeah, I'm. But here's the deal. What you're saying, I've tried to argue something close to that. Juries would never buy that. A court won't buy it. The court says there is a rule, and unless you literally cannot conform your conduct, which is a very hard bar to go over, or you're in such a terrible shape that you don't even know the difference, which is a terrible bar to go over. The point is that if you do wrong, if you go 100 miles an hour on 270, you're wrong. It's a strict liability crime. You're wrong. But the bottom line is you might be able to come into court with all sorts of mitigation and say the reason this person did that is the following. And I think it's the same thing here. You have free will. Whatever happens to you, some people are more resilient than others, but you have free will. This may put you on what you grew up with may put you on a path toward this, but you have free will. And by having a good heart, be a decent person, that gets you through, that you can deal with this, you can deal with the exigencies that all of us face in life.
Yeah, right. And I think, I mean, and this is in that sense, I mean, all of Pirkei Avot is sort of moralistic literature,
Right.
right? It's seeking to tell you how to develop your mind, if you will, so that you embody these desirable qualities, right? And that's really the whole point, because we're not automatons, right? We're not automatons. If we were, right, I mean, if we were automatons, we wouldn't have to have this discussion, right? I mean, and that's what, I mean, I recall saying this within the past week or so, although I don't recall whether it was in Pirkei Avot or in a sermon, right? I wish I did, but what is the point of Judaism, right? What is the point of Judaism, right? And to me, the point of Judaism is to teach you how to be a mensch.
Right.
That's what it's all about, right? And even the rituals are there to teach you how to be a mensch, right? And that's the whole point. And if you're gonna, as far as I'm concerned, if you're gonna be hyper observant of rituals, but you're not a mensch, you've missed the whole point. You've totally missed the whole point, right? But we're not automatons.
Isn't there a
Uh,
prayer? Isn't there a prayer that we say, or a part of a service? And I know that my Christian friends have adopted part of it too. Something about if you it has to do with talking about the anatomy, and if you do this, then in the end it is essentially boils down to all the riches and famousness and everything else that you have means nothing if you do not have love. I think it was cited from Corinthians. Sorry for to Judaism, but maybe now you know what I'm referring to. There's a prayer of ours like that too.
I'd have to think about that. I'm not necessarily aware of it, but certainly the attitude, yeah, absolutely. All right, let's go on. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan said unto them, go forth and observe which is the evil way which a man should shun. Rabbi Eliezer said, an evil eye. Rabbi Joshua said, an evil companion. Rabbi Yosef said, an evil neighbor. Rabbi Shimon said, one who borrows and does not repay. For he that borrows from man is as one who borrows from God, blessed be he. As it is said, the wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous deal graciously and give. Rabbi Elazar said, an evil heart. Rabbi Yochanan said to them, I prefer the words of Elazar ben Arach, for in his words, your words are included. Okay, now, a couple of things. I'm going to be a little bit more didactic here. One is that this whole thing is structured like in an ascending way. Okay, the example being, right, and all of them are the opposite of what they said before, except that Rabban Shimon said in the good things, foresight, okay, and there is no really opposite of foresight, right? But the other thing that I forgot to mention, but when you look at this as like an ascending way, all right. So Rabbi Joshua says an evil companion or a good companion, and Rabbi Yosef said an evil neighbor or a good neighbor, right? So the first thing is why, and let's say companion or friend as friend, right? Because that's the word haver. Why is a good neighbor better than a good friend, or an evil neighbor worse than an evil friend? Why? Yeah, so again, just hop in.
Well, my thinking is that, you're kind of influenced by your friends. You can influence them, but if you tend to hang around with, say, evil people, say, a local gang or something, you will kind of be pulled into what they do, and it could change your attitude and your whole way of doing things. And the same thing with neighbors, I would think.
Right. Okay. So what Bartanura says is that your neighbor is adjacent to you 24/7, right? Whereas your friend could be far away, right? And that, that is Bartanura's point, right? Is that, a good neighbor is better than a good friend because your neighbor is there 24/7, right? And conversely, a bad neighbor is worse than a bad friend because the bad neighbor is there 24/7. Okay. And one who borrows and does not repay, for he that borrows from man is as one who borrows from God. Okay. How is somebody who borrows from man like one who borrows from God?
Man is made in God's image.
Right. And there are, statements that, when we degrade another human being, we are in fact degrading God because the human being is the image of God. Right? So that's true, and I think that's part of it. But I think there's also the sense that the Christians have a word for it, stewardship, right? That everything really comes from God and everything really belongs to God, right? So that what you have does not really belong to you. It belongs to God, and God has entrusted it to you to make use of it, right? And to make use of it in a way that is beneficial and productive for society, right? So that if I borrow from you and I don't repay, right? I mean, first of all, like, I've misappropriated something that really belongs to God, right? And I've also, I mean, I would say it's like the opportunity cost, right? If I borrow something from you, then you no longer have it, and therefore there's the opportunity cost of what you might have done with it that is beneficial to society, right? So I think that that's part of it as well. Okay, yeah, Marilyn.
I think it's broader than just borrow. It's the using of skills and labor and not paying for it, such as slavery, such as not paying for something. You had someone come to your house and do something and you refuse to pay them, or anything where you're taking something without paying to another person is using resources that could have been used for something good.
Right, right. It's all of that, right? Because it
Mhm.
all comes from God and ultimately belongs to God and is simply, you know, entrusted to us, right? With,
Yeah. And I think
yeah,
another part of that is having resources that you keep from other people, that you don't share, you're not generous, you don't give to charity or whatever. I think that's all part of that same thing.
right,
Part of it too is it violates the Ten Commandments. You're
Yes.
commanded not to commit theft, and that's a theft essentially.
Right.
right. I mean, again, I'm not sure that the Hebrew words mean precisely the same as the English words, right? I mean, I think I could make an argument that borrowing and not repaying is not a violation of the commandment lo tignov, right? Because unlike the English, where right, there's a difference between, right, theft and robbery, right? Because, right,
Well,
I
robbery is
mean,
when somebody's there and takes something from you by force. Theft is when they
exactly.
steal from you. But in our system, there's a thing called conversion. I'm not going to go into the weeds, but there's a thing called conversion, or Maryland would know, larceny after trust or embezzlement that they use in the
Right. So what
CPA
the
world.
point that I'm making is that lo tignov actually is more like you shall not commit robbery than you shall
Oh, okay,
not
I got it
commit
then.
theft.
Okay,
That's
I
the
got it.
point, is that I think, again, and this is the problem, right? Because we're using English translations and there's not a one-to-one correspondence, right? But I think lo tignov actually implies the use of force, right? Whereas borrowing and not repaying does not involve the use of force, right? So it's not technically, I mean, it doesn't mean it's a good thing, but it's not technically a violation of that commandment. Okay. Let's go on. They each said three things. Okay, that is to say, these five disciples. Rabbi Eliezer said, let the honor of your friend be as dear to you as your own. and be not easily provoked to anger, and repent one day before your death. Okay, so it's right. Like, I mean, the first two are self-explanatory, right? Second is maybe difficult to follow these days. I mean, when a thousand things happen every day that could justifiably provoke me to anger. But repent one day before your death. Okay, thoughts on that statement?
You might as well repent every day because you don't know when the day of your death is.
Exactly. Exactly. Right? Not as you might as well, you really must, right? Because I mean, unless you've been sentenced to death, right? Or, unless you, God forbid, have a terminal illness where, the prognosis is so definite, right? I mean, most of us don't know that the day before we die is the day before we're going to die, right? Most of us don't know that, right? So, yeah, you have to repent every day because you never know, right? I mean, it's kind of the opposite of the Romans saying, eat, drink, and be merry, right? Eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow you might die, right? Well, repent because tomorrow you might die. Okay, so this is all very nice and pretty, but he also said, warm yourself before the fire of the wise, but beware of being singed by their glowing coals, right? For their bite is the bite of a fox, and their sting is the sting of a scorpion, and their hiss is the hiss of a serpent, and all their words are like coals of fire. Okay. All right. So Rabbi Eliezer, first of all, like Torah is nothing. It's not anything to fool around with, right? It can be the key to eternal life, but it can also like leave you burned, right? And it's interesting. I mean, because well, all right, let me just say one thing before I sort of get into the meta. Okay. The bite of a fox. Okay, why the bite of a fox? And Bartanura says something really interesting. He says that a fox bite is the hardest for a doctor to treat because of the nature of their teeth, right? The teeth are small and sharp. And if you have a fox bite, the surgeon can't simply sew it up. Okay, what they have to, I know very little about fox teeth and very little about surgical technique. I'm going to trust Bartanura knew better, but he says that if you are bitten by a fox, the surgeon actually has to make an incision, widen the wound, and then sew it up. It cannot be sewn up as is, and that's why bite of a fox as opposed to a dog or a wolf or whatever, because fox bites are particularly difficult to treat. I mean, if somebody knows this better than I don't know. Has anybody here been bitten by a fox? But the broader point, I think, is that, and I gave a whole high holiday sermon on this a few years ago, right? Is that Torah, the two metaphors for Torah are fire and water, right? Now, what do those metaphors say about Torah or about religion, right? I mean, we can't live without water, right? We can't live without water, right? But water can also flood, right? And drown us and destroy. I mean, you know, Asheville, North Carolina, right? When water gets out of control. Can't live with it, can't live without it, rather, but it's also incredibly destructive. Fire, the same thing, right? Can't live without fire, right? Fire gets out of control, destroys everything in its path. Look at the wildfires in LA, right? And I mean, I think it's not an accident that the two main metaphors for Torah or for religion are fire and water, right? And I think that that's what Rabbi Eliezer is saying too, is that, you know, and I have to say that, look, the week that we are entering into in the Jewish calendar, right? For people who are prone to fanaticism and racism and zealotry, this is your week, right? I mean, Saturday morning, the maftir that we read is the commandment to commit genocide. It's a commandment to commit genocide against the Amalekites, right? And then the maftir, right? King Saul loses his kingdom because he had compassion on POWs, right? He was commanded to kill all the POWs, and he didn't do that, right? And therefore lost his kingship, right? And then on Purim, right, we scream and we cheer when Haman's 10 sons are hanged. Okay, well, Haman had it coming. What did his 10 sons do? Right? And then you read the numbers of Persians that the Jews killed subsequent to this, tens of thousands, right? I mean, and we, because we're nice people, we read this, and I have no right. We explain it away, right? I mean, my sermon for Saturday morning, which I've already written, is a master class in explaining this all away, right? But, you know, anybody remember the name Baruch Goldstein? Right? Baruch Goldstein, an American immigrant to Israel, a doctor, no less, the day before Purim in 1994 goes into the Mosque of the Patriarchs in Hebron and murders, I think it was 34 worshipers in cold blood, right? He didn't read this as a metaphor. He read this as a live mitzvah, all right? And Smotrich, who was in Washington, right, who just met with our Treasury Secretary today, right? Smotrich is a Kahanist. He's an absolute Kahanist, right? He reads this and says, go thou and do likewise. And if he were the prime minister instead of Netanyahu, that's what they would do, right? So religion for us, right, it's a source of all these nice and good values, right? It's also a source of tremendous fanaticism and murderousness, right? And which is the true Judaism? They're both true, right? It's a question of how you train your mind. And, you've heard me say this, right? There is no point that cannot be proven through selective reading and cherry picking of Jewish texts, right? It's all a question of which text you read selectively and how you cherry pick them, right? And I'm going to cherry pick them on the side of life and the side of being a good neighbor and the side of getting along with everybody. But there are Jews who read it very differently, and they have on what to rely as well. All right, so we've hit the end of a Mishnah, so I'm not going to go on. But if there are, I know, I've said a few things. So if there are comments, questions, thoughts, rebuttals, please jump in. Yeah, so
Rabbi, I was listening to what you said, but when I initially looked at this, I thought it was literally concerning the wise scholars and the rabbis that, it's good to listen to them, but maybe they wouldn't have the patience with someone who was new and listening to them, and might not be as willing to accept their opinions or their thoughts. I didn't really look at this as being Torah.
right. Well, I mean, first of all, you could be right. And second of all, things can work on a lot of different levels. Right? I mean, but yeah, I mean, look, there are this is a professional literature of a certain culture, right? And it's not, look, and to this day, it is absolutely acceptable in the Beit Midrash, in the yeshiva, to really go after your opponent. All right? But doesn't mean, at the end of the day, when the lesson is over, you don't go out and grab a beer together. Right? But if I were to say in other words, if we were study partners, right, it would be perfectly normal for me to say to you, Sue, that is the most idiotic thing I ever heard. right? I wouldn't do it, but in the context in which we are operating, that would be like not a smart thing for me to do. Right? It's all a question of context, right? And I don't know, I mean, I don't know what like real life law school is like. I do remember that when I was in college, the paper chase was on, right? And that professor also, right? I mean, John Houseman, right? He was constantly calling his students idiots. And that was like, in the context of that law school, was perfectly acceptable and normal. Okay. I mean, it's all a question of context, but things can work on multiple levels, right? And I mean, were this not the week before Purim, some of the things I just said might not necessarily be on my mind, right? But because it is the week before Purim, and I have a long memory, and I take this stuff seriously, so it is on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, folks. Good night. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Good night.
Shabbat
Thank
shalom.
you.
Good night.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.